The car screeched to a halt, its tires gripping the road with a deafening squeal. Hamlet's body jerked violently, his head slamming against the seatbelt, his vision blurring as the world around him spun out of control. He didn't know what had happened, or how he had ended up in this mess. All he knew was that the last thing he remembered was Regina, the school beauty he had admired from afar, standing at the edge of the street, her face a mix of confusion and shock. He had tried to save her. The darkness that followed was sudden and complete. And then, nothing. 3 years later I woke up to the same cold, sterile hospital room, the scent of antiseptic thick in the air. The beeping of machines was constant, their rhythm as unyielding as the silence that hung over the room. My body was stiff, my mind sluggish. As I turned my head, the image of Hamlet, motionless, lifeless, his body hooked to countless machines, hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't a nightmare that would fade when I opened my eyes. This was real. Hamlet, the man I had married in place of my own will, the man whose fate had been sealed by a contract made long before we were born, was lying in front of me, a shell of the person he once was. And yet, I hadn't left. I hadn't broken free. For 3 years, I had stayed by his side, fulfilling my duty, honoring a promise made long ago. What had I become? A prisoner of duty? Or was I simply a fool who had let life sweep her away? "Are you still awake, dear?" A soft voice broke my thoughts, pulling my attention toward Hamlet's mother. She stood at the doorway, her eyes filled with concern. She hadn't changed much over the years, still the same demanding, calculating woman who had been relentless in her pursuit of the marriage contract. "I'm fine," I replied, my voice hoarse. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to sit up. The weight of it all was suffocating. "How long has it been?" 3 years, Livy. It's been 3 years since the accident. Hamlet's been in a coma for so long, and she stopped herself, eyes hardening. "But now we have to make sure he doesn't lose any more time." I nodded silently, the words like daggers to my chest. She was already thinking ahead, already planning for his recovery, as if I didn't exist in this equation at all. "Has he shown any signs of waking up?" I asked, my voice betraying the hope I hadn't allowed myself to feel. She shook her head. "Not yet. But we're hopeful. The doctors say that one day, he will wake up. He has to." Her voice grew softer, almost pleading, as she stepped closer to the bed. "You're still his wife, Livy. He needs you." I bit my lip, pushing back the surge of frustration that welled up inside me. The woman I had once thought of as a mother now felt like a stranger. She didn't care about me. She only cared about her son, about fulfilling the contract that had bound us together. But I was no longer the same Livy who had blindly followed the path laid out for her. I had been reborn, literally, and now, everything was different. I was no longer the girl who had been pushed into this marriage out of obligation. Now, I was someone who knew the truth. The bitter truth that Hamlet had never loved me. He had loved Regina, the school beauty who had never cared about him. "Livy," Hamlet's mother spoke again, her voice sharper this time, "I know it's hard. But you have to hold on. For Hamlet. For the future of the family." The weight of those words was too much. I wanted to scream at her, to ask her how she could possibly care so much about family when the only thing that mattered was my life, my choices, my happiness. But instead, I nodded, the words sticking in my throat. "I know." She turned her gaze back to Hamlet, her eyes clouding with a mixture of hope and desperation. "We'll get through this, Livy. I'm sure of it." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the truth was, I felt trapped. The day I had married Hamlet, I had promised myself I would be a dutiful wife, that I would honor the contract. But what did that even mean now? What was I holding on to? A future that had already been stolen from me? Or a dream that had never truly existed? The question lingered in my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of the end, or if it was just the beginning of something even worse. 3 years earlier, before the accident, everything had seemed so simple. Hamlet and I were children when our families decided to marry us off to each other. It had been one of those arrangements that felt like a formality, something we would grow into as we got older. But things changed. We grew up, and our futures were mapped out, and then he met her. Regina. I hadn't known about them. At least, not until that fateful day when Hamlet's world collided with mine. We were both at Tino University, each going our separate ways. He had become a well-known figure, popular with the students, admired for his good looks and his quiet intelligence. But beneath that calm exterior, something was brewing. He had fallen in love. I never knew. I had never suspected. Regina, the gorgeous, untouchable beauty, had caught his eye, and they had been seeing each other in secret. They had kept their relationship hidden from the world, and it wasn't until I found out, quite by accident, that I understood the truth. It had started innocently enough. Hamlet had been feeling sick, so I was tasked with delivering some medicine to him in his dorm room. I had no idea what I was walking into. A simple task turned into a discovery that shattered my world. As I approached the building, I saw Regina. She was standing by the door, her eyes cold and distant as she locked eyes with me. The tension was palpable. She knew who I was, of course. I was the girl who had been promised to Hamlet since childhood. And then I said it, I'm Hamlet's fiancé. That's when it all changed. Regina's face turned pale, and I saw the pain flicker in her eyes. I didn't know what it meant at the time. I thought it was just jealousy, or maybe a misunderstanding. But I was wrong. Later that night, Hamlet was in a car accident. It was supposed to be a simple drive to meet her, to talk to her, to clear up the misunderstanding. But instead, he had tried to save her. In a moment of reckless love, he had thrown himself into the path of an oncoming car to protect her. And in that instant, his life changed forever. The fallout Hamlet's accident left us all in a mess of confusion and pain. The once bright future that we had ahead of us, both as individuals and as families, was now overshadowed by tragedy. Regina, though, she moved on. It didn't take long for her to climb to stardom. She became a movie queen, adored by millions, her career skyrocketing as Hamlet lay unconscious, unable to fight for his own future. I, on the other hand, was left to pick up the pieces. I had married Hamlet, as promised, though it felt more like a prison sentence than a marriage. I had never loved him. Not the way I should have. And when he woke up 3 years later, his mind was a blur. He didn't remember me, or the contract, or the pain we had both suffered. But he remembered Regina. He remembered her face, her smile, her love. It wasn't long before he accused me of being the one who had trapped him. He had loved Regina, and I had been the one to stand in the way. The internet turned on me. I was cyberbullied. I became a villain in a story that wasn't even mine to begin with. It felt like the world was against me, and I couldn't escape. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I woke up again. This time, I was back before the accident. Before the pain. Before everything. And this time, I wasn't going to let the past repeat itself. I woke up with a gasp, my breath ragged as the familiar, sterile hospital room greeted me. The constant beeping of machines, the faint scent of antiseptic, it all felt like a heavy fog settling over me. I blinked a few times, trying to process the reality that surrounded me. My mind was a mess, and my body felt like it had been through an endless war. But there was something different this time. The familiar weight on my shoulders, the one I had carried for years, since the day Hamlet had gone into a coma, was suddenly lighter. Almost non-existent. It was as if I had been given a second chance, a fresh start. I slowly turned my head, and there he was, Hamlet. Still unconscious. Still lying motionless, hooked up to the same machines that had kept him alive for the past 3 years. He looked almost peaceful now, the lines of pain and despair replaced with an eerie calm. But it wasn't peace that I felt. It was something else, something darker, more insidious. The weight of everything that had happened felt like a heavy chain around my neck, tightening with every passing second. I looked around, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The hospital room was exactly the same, but something inside me told me it wasn't. It was as if time had been turned back, rewound, and I had been given a chance to change everything. I sat up with a jolt, my mind spinning. Could it be? Had I really gone back in time? Before I could even fully process the thought, the door creaked open, and in walked Hamlet's mother. Her eyes locked with mine, and for the briefest of moments, I saw a flash of something like recognition in them. Something unfamiliar, as though the world she had carefully constructed around herself was about to crack. "Livy," she said, her voice sharp, like she was still adjusting to the reality of the situation. "You're awake." I'm so relieved. I nodded, though I couldn't quite bring myself to speak just yet. How could I? How could I be anything but confused, even after all that had happened? The past, present, and future were all blending together, each moment feeling like a fragment of a dream I couldn't wake up from. "How long has it been?" I finally asked, my voice low, as if the question might reveal something I wasn't prepared to hear. 3 years, she replied, her tone softening. Hamlet has been in a coma for that long. It's been hard on all of us, especially with the accident and everything that followed. But now, we're hopeful. He's going to wake up soon. He has to. I looked at Hamlet again, the anger and bitterness swirling inside me like a storm. I had stayed by his side, bound by a promise, a contract made long before either of us had the chance to choose our own paths. But what was the point? I had married him not out of love, but out of duty. And in doing so, I had watched my own happiness slip through my fingers. Hamlet's mother seemed to notice the shift in my expression, her gaze narrowing. She was never one to miss the smallest change in anyone's demeanor. "I know it's difficult," she said, her voice hardening. "But you made a promise, Livy. You can't break it now." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her that I was done with this life, that I wasn't going to live in the shadow of a contract any longer. But I didn't. I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I kept quiet, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. The contract, the promise, it was nothing but a chain, dragging me down into a life I had never wanted. But that didn't mean I couldn't change things now. This was my second chance, my chance to rewrite my own story. I wasn't going to let the past repeat itself. Not this time. "I'm not sure I can do this anymore," I said, my voice quiet but firm. Hamlet's mother's eyes flickered, and for the first time, I saw a crack in her otherwise impenetrable armor. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone almost accusatory. "I mean, I'm not sure I can keep pretending," I replied, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm not sure I can keep living a life that isn't mine. I didn't choose this, and I can't keep going on like this." She was silent for a moment, her eyes studying me carefully. "You think you can just walk away from everything? From Hamlet? From the family?" I stood up from the bed, feeling a surge of emotion flood through me. "I don't owe anyone anything. Especially not him." I motioned toward Hamlet's lifeless form. "He doesn't love me. He never did. And you," I turned to face Hamlet's mother, my voice cold. "You don't care about me. You only care about your son. You want me to stay because of a contract. Not because you care." Her face tightened, and she opened her mouth to say something, but I interrupted her. "I'm done with this life. I'm not going to play the part of a dutiful wife anymore. I'm going to live for me, for my own happiness." She stared at me, a mix of shock and disbelief in her eyes. For a moment, I thought she might lash out, but instead, she just stood there, her face hardening into the familiar mask of indifference. Do what you want, she spat, turning on her heel. But remember, you'll always be bound by this family. No matter how far you run. I watched her leave, her words hanging in the air like poison. For so long, I had let her dictate my every move, and now, finally, I was free. I wasn't going to let the past control me anymore. I had been reborn, and this time, I was going to make my own choices. 3 years earlier, a promise that bound us the past felt so distant now, almost unreal. How had I let myself be dragged into this web of obligation and guilt? How had I let my life slip away, bound by a promise made long before I had even understood what love truly meant? It all started when Hamlet's family and my family had agreed on a marriage contract between us. We were just children then, too young to understand the weight of such a decision. Handsome, charming, well-liked. He had his own dreams, his own life. And then there was me, someone trapped in a world I didn't choose. I didn't know it at the time, but Hamlet had already found someone else. He had already fallen for Regina, the beautiful, untouchable girl who had captured his heart the moment they met. I had never suspected. How could I have? I had been so wrapped up in my own confusion, my own sense of duty, that I never saw the signs. The day I found out was the day that everything changed. It was supposed to be a simple task, deliver some medicine to Hamlet, check on him. But that day, everything shifted. I walked into his dorm room, not knowing that I was about to walk into a nightmare. And there she was, Regina. Standing in the doorway, her eyes cold as she locked eyes with me. "You're his fiancé," she asked, her voice a sharp whisper. I nodded, confused by the tension in the air. "Yes. I'm Livy." Regina's expression shifted, a mixture of disbelief and pain flashing across her face. And just like that, the truth crashed into me. Hamlet had been seeing her behind my back, hiding their relationship from everyone, including me. And I had been oblivious to it all. That night, Hamlet was in an accident. A car hit him as he tried to protect Regina from danger. He had thrown himself into the path of the car to save her. And just like that, everything changed. Hamlet was no longer the carefree young man I had once known. He was a broken man, trapped in a coma, his future uncertain, and his love for Regina unspoken. I stayed by his side, fulfilling my duty, but it felt like I was suffocating. I wasn't the one he wanted. I wasn't the one he loved. And yet, here I was, bound to him by a contract that neither of us had asked for. The days stretched into an endless blur of white hospital walls and the sterile scent of antiseptic. I had thought, in my naive optimism, that things would change once Hamlet woke up. But now that he had, I wasn't sure what to feel. A part of me wanted to feel relief, to celebrate the fact that he had finally opened his eyes. But another part of me, a part one couldn't quite ignore, was drowning in the weight of my own dissatisfaction. He was awake. And yet, I felt more trapped than ever. "Livy," Hamlet's voice broke through my thoughts. His eyes were still cloudy with confusion, and he looked at me like he was seeing a stranger. "What happened? Where am I?" I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. This was it. The moment I had waited for, prayed for even, when I thought I could finally have a fresh start. But here he was, asking about Regina. Asking about the love he had left behind. "You're in the hospital," I said, my voice steady. "You've been in a coma for 3 years. His eyes flickered with recognition, though they were still clouded with confusion. 3 years? He repeated, almost to himself. Then, he frowned, his expression distant. "Regina. Is she here?" I felt my stomach twist, a knot forming in the pit of my belly. It was like déjà vu. The moment I had feared had finally come. Hamlet hadn't woken up to see me. He had woken up to see her. "She's not here," I said, my voice quiet, almost too soft. "She's moved on, Hamlet. You've been unconscious for 3 years. Things have changed." He stared at me, his face crumpling in disbelief. No, no. She promised she would wait for me. His voice wavered, like a fragile thread that might snap at any moment. You're my wife. You were supposed to be here for me. But she's the one I love. Why am I here with you? The words felt like a slap to the face, and I could feel the sting of them deep in my chest. He had never seen me. Not for who I was, not for what I had done for him. To him, I was just a placeholder, a contract, a duty. Not a wife, not a partner. I've been here for you because I made a promise, I said, the words coming out more sharply than I intended. I stayed because that's what I was supposed to do. But that's not why I'm here anymore. His eyes widened, confusion still thick in his gaze. What are you talking about? You're my wife. No, I cut him off, my heart pounding in my chest. I'm not your wife, Hamlet. I never was. Not really. I was a promise made long before either of us had a choice in the matter. You were never mine, and I was never yours. There it was. The truth, laid bare before both of us. He stared at me, his expression changing from disbelief to something darker, something filled with anger, with betrayal. But I wasn't going to back down. I wasn't going to let him manipulate me anymore. You really think that? Hamlet asked, his voice shaking. After everything I've been through? After everything we've been through? I shook my head, fighting to keep my emotions in check. I'm not the one you love. And I'm not the one you need. He flinched as if my words physically hurt him. But I couldn't stop. You love Regina. You always have. You never loved me. And that's fine, Hamlet. I'm done pretending. For a moment, there was silence between us, an unbearable, suffocating silence that felt like the weight of years pressing down on us both. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words never came. He looked lost, like a man trapped in a memory he couldn't escape. And in that moment, I realized something. He was never going to be the man I had hoped for. Not now, not ever. The man I had tried so hard to save, the man I had sacrificed my own happiness for, was never going to see me for who I was. I was just a chapter in his life that he had closed long ago. And now, I needed to close that chapter myself. The past rewritten 3 years earlier, everything had been different. I had been someone else, someone who believed in fate, who thought that duty and obligation were enough to build a life. I had married Hamlet out of a sense of responsibility, of tradition. But that was before I knew the truth. That was before I knew about Regina. I could still remember the first time I met her. It had been at a school event, one of those meaningless gatherings that people attended out of obligation. She had been there, of course, always surrounded by a crowd, always the center of attention. And I, like everyone else, had watched her from a distance, marveling at how effortlessly beautiful she was. But I never thought much of it. Not at first. It wasn't until one fateful day that I discovered the truth. Hamlet had been sick, and I was sent to deliver some medicine to his dorm. It seemed simple enough. But when I arrived, I saw them. Hamlet and Regina, together, in a way I never could have imagined. It was so clear now, so painfully obvious, that they had been seeing each other in secret. They had been in love, long before I ever entered the picture. I was nothing more than a placeholder in their story. A pawn in a game I didn't even know I was playing. And when I confronted them, I felt something crack inside me. It wasn't just jealousy. It wasn't even anger. It was betrayal. Hamlet, the man I was married to, had never been mine. And I had been fooling myself for so long, thinking that maybe, just maybe, he could love me too. But it wasn't meant to be. It never had been. That night, Hamlet was in the accident. It had been a split-second decision, one that cost him everything. He had thrown himself into harm's way to save Regina, to protect her. In the end, she had left him behind, moving on with her life while he lay unconscious. And I had stayed. I stayed because I had made a promise. Because I couldn't break the chain that had bound me to him. Even though he had never loved me. Even though he had never seen me. The awakening now, 3 years later, he was awake. And I had nothing left to give. Hamlet looked at me with wide, confused eyes, and I knew that he didn't understand. He didn't understand how I could be standing here, after everything that had happened. After all the years of sacrifice, of being trapped in a life I didn't want. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that I had been given a second chance. A chance to rewrite everything. I wasn't going to live my life for anyone else anymore. I wasn't going to be a pawn in someone else's story. I was going to be free. But freedom didn't come easily. Not when everything I had known was built on a foundation of lies. I looked at Hamlet one last time, my heart heavy with all the things I could never say, and I turned away. There was nothing left for me here. Not anymore. I wasn't going to wait for him to wake up and realize the truth. I wasn't going to keep pretending that I was the one he needed. That was his mistake. Not mine. The door slammed shut behind me, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was breathing again. It's funny how life can turn on a dime. One moment, you think you know exactly where you're headed, and the next, you realize you've been walking down the wrong path all along. That's exactly how I felt the day I decided to stop pretending, stop playing the role of the dutiful wife. But even as I turned my back on Hamlet and the life I had been forced into, I couldn't shake the feeling that my past would come back to haunt me. And it did. Hamlet's mother, despite everything, still wanted to believe that I could somehow bring her son back. After all, her only goal was to fulfill the marriage contract, no matter what it cost her son or me. She needed me. I was the only one left who could save Hamlet and, by extension, her family. She was desperate, and I could feel her eyes following me, like a shadow that refused to leave. I wasn't going to play her game anymore. Back to the beginning, it was strange though, when I first woke up in the hospital, I didn't immediately realize what had happened. I thought I was just another victim of the accident. But then it hit me. I had been reborn. I had somehow gone back in time, back to the days before Hamlet's accident, before everything fell apart. I was given a second chance, a chance to make different choices, to change my destiny. I hadn't asked for this. I hadn't wanted it. But now that it was here, I knew I had to use it. This time, I wasn't going to play the role of the obedient wife. I wasn't going to allow Hamlet's family to pull me around like a puppet on a string. I was going to break free, no matter the cost. The first person I spoke to was my mother. She had always been the one who pushed me into this world of obligation, of duty. She didn't see it at the time, but she had always known that I wasn't happy. And when I told her I wanted to break off the engagement, she was furious. "You can't do that, Livy," she said, her voice sharp. "Do you know what this will do to our family? You can't just walk away from a marriage contract that has been in place for years." But I had already made up my mind. "I won't marry Hamlet," I said, my voice steady. "Not because I don't care about him, but because I can't live a life of lies. I won't be tied down by a promise that wasn't mine to make." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "You're making a mistake." "No," I replied, my heart heavy with certainty. The mistake was ever agreeing to it in the first place. I left her standing there, the weight of my decision hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. But I knew it was the right choice. I couldn't be the person my family wanted me to be anymore. I had to be me. Confronting the past the next day, Hamlet's mother came to visit. She had always been an imposing figure in my life, and now, as I looked at her, I saw the desperation in her eyes. She wanted me to marry Hamlet again, to make everything right, to save her son. She didn't care about my feelings. She didn't care about the life I had lost. "You don't understand, Livy," she said, her voice pleading. Hamlet needs you. The family needs you. You can't just walk away from this. I'm not walking away from him, I replied, my voice firm. I'm walking away from this contract. From this life. I'm not the person you think I am, and I'm not going to spend the rest of my life pretending to be. She stared at me, stunned. I had never spoken to her this way. Never had the courage to stand up for myself. But now, with the weight of my past and my future on my shoulders, I couldn't stay silent any longer. You're making a terrible mistake, she said, her voice cold and sharp. Maybe, I replied, but I'll be making my own decisions now. The truth about Hamlet, it wasn't until later that night, when I found myself alone in the quiet of my room, that the full weight of my decision hit me. I had broken free. But at what cost? Hamlet was still in a coma. His body still unmoving, hooked up to machines. He had no idea what I was doing, what I was giving up. He still thought I was the one who could save him. But I wasn't his savior. I never had been. Hamlet had always loved someone else, Regina, the school beauty. The woman he had risked everything for. And even if I had stayed by his side, even if I had honored the marriage contract, I would never have been the one to heal his broken heart. He had loved her, and no amount of duty, no amount of sacrifice, could change that. It was ironic, really. I had spent so many years caring for him, loving him from a distance, but it wasn't enough. And now, even in his coma, he was still holding on to her. She had been the one who had filled his heart, who had been the person he had tried to save. But in the end, it was me, always me, who had been left behind. A chance for revenge. It wasn't until I saw Regina's name in the headlines that I realized just how much I had been overlooked. Regina had become a movie queen, a star, loved and adored by millions. She had everything, beauty, fame, wealth. And Hamlet? He was still lying in a hospital bed, his body a shell of what it used to be, his love for her unrequited. I was angry. Furious, even. And for the first time, I realized that I could use my power to get what I wanted. It wasn't just about breaking free from the chains of the marriage contract anymore. It was about making sure Regina never had the life she had always dreamed of. I began to play the game. I knew that Regina's image as the pure, innocent beauty was her ticket to success. But what if I could take that away? What if I could expose her for the selfish, manipulative woman she truly was? And so, I did. I used everything at my disposal to turn the tables. The live streaming platform that had once been Regina's ticket to fame became my weapon. I manipulated the narrative, exposed her for the fraud she was, and slowly, methodically, tore down the empire she had built. It wasn't easy. It wasn't clean. But in the end, it was worth it. Regina's career crumbled. Her fans turned on her. And in the midst of her downfall, I rose to the top. The last straw. But even as I watched Regina's life unravel, a part of me couldn't help but feel sorry for Hamlet. He had always been the pawn in this game, never in control of his own destiny. His love for Regina had cost him everything. And now, as he sat in that hospital bed, a shadow of the man he had once been, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the only one who had lost. I had won, yes. But at what cost? The truth was, I didn't care anymore. I had finally freed myself from the past, from the life I had been forced into. And as for Hamlet? Well, that was his problem now. The weeks that followed felt like a blur, full of emotions I wasn't sure how to process. The battle for freedom, for control over my own life, had taken its toll. But it also gave me something I hadn't had in years, clarity. I was no longer a pawn in Hamlet's world, no longer trapped in the web of duty and obligation. The chains had been broken, and with that, I had stepped into a new world, one that was completely mine to shape. But it wasn't as simple as that. Freedom, it seemed, came at a price. Regina's fall. Regina, on the other hand, had paid that price in full. Her career, once at its peak, had fallen apart so quickly it was almost unreal. Her fans, those who had adored her for her beauty and her pure image, were now revolted by the truth that had come out. And it wasn't just her career that crumbled. Her reputation was destroyed. The love story she had built around herself, the one where she played the role of the innocent, devoted lover, was nothing but a lie. The scandal that I had orchestrated had spread like wildfire. Pictures, receipts, and stories about her flirtations with powerful men behind the scenes were plastered all over the internet. Her reputation, built on the image of a faithful woman, was shattered beyond repair. She was no longer the school beauty, she was the villain in her own story. But it wasn't over for Regina. She wasn't done yet. I could see it in her eyes as I watched from a distance. She was plotting her next move. She always had a plan. And now, with everything she had lost, she had nothing to lose. I had won the battle, but I wasn't sure if I was ready for what would come next. Regina had a way of clawing her way back to the top, no matter how many times she was knocked down. But this time, I wasn't going to let her. Not after everything she had done. Hamlet's awakening. It wasn't just Regina I had to worry about. Hamlet's reawakening was the beginning of a new chapter in his life, a life I had never imagined. When he first woke up from his coma, I had hoped for some kind of miracle, that somehow the man I had cared for would remember me and the life we had built together. But that hope died quickly. Hamlet was a different person now. His memories were fractured, and all he could remember was Regina. His love for her was the same as it had been before the accident, unshakable, unwavering, obsessive. But even more than that, there was something else. He wasn't just broken physically. His soul, it seemed, was shattered too. He hadn't come back from the accident stronger, more determined. No, he had come back weaker, clinging to the past, unable to move forward. The man I had hoped would wake up and fight for a life beyond the accident was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was just a shadow of Hamlet, a man who couldn't let go of the love he had lost. The deal with Hamlet's mother. As much as I had broken free from my past, there were still ties that bound me to Hamlet's family. The marriage contract, the family legacy, the company they had built, all of it had been a part of my life, whether I liked it or not. And Hamlet's mother, the woman who had controlled my life for so long, wasn't going to let me go that easily. She had come to me, as expected, offering a deal I couldn't refuse. The Hamlet family had been falling apart. The business was crumbling. The public was losing faith in them. But I could help her turn it all around. She needed me to marry Hamlet, to save him, to restore his place in the world, to bring the family back from the brink of destruction. But I wasn't interested in saving anyone. Not anymore. Not after everything I had been through. And yet, there was a part of me, something deep inside, that couldn't completely walk away. The Hamlet family had given so much to my own, and now, at my lowest, they were offering me a way out. The catch was simple: I would have to marry Hamlet again. And I would have to bring him back from the abyss. A new alliance. The thought of marrying Hamlet again made my skin crawl. But this time, I wasn't the naive girl I had been before. I wasn't going to be a passive player in someone else's game. I had power now, a kind of power that I could use to shape my future on my own terms. I had become a significant player in the entertainment world, using my investments to back popular movies, creating opportunities for myself. I had seen what the right amount of influence and money could do. And with this leverage, I could use my position to negotiate with Hamlet's mother, to secure my future. But I wasn't going to marry Hamlet for love or for duty. No, this marriage would be different. This time, I was doing it for my own reasons. For my own gain. I sat across from Hamlet's mother in her lavish office, the weight of the decision heavy on my shoulders. "You know what I need, Livy," she said, her voice full of authority, as always. "If you marry Hamlet, it will save the family. Everything will go back to the way it was." I knew what she was asking, what she was really offering. She wanted me to take on the role I had been forced into before, to play the dutiful wife and save the Hamlet family name. But this time, I wasn't going to be a pawn in her game. I was going to be the queen. I'll do it, I said, my voice steady. But not for you. Not for Hamlet. I'm doing this for me. I want 50% of the Hamlet family shares. I want control. I want power. She didn't even flinch. Done, she said, her voice unwavering. As long as it secures Hamlet's future and saves the family, I'll give you whatever you want. And just like that, I had the leverage I needed. I had made my deal, and now it was time to execute it. The final game as Hamlet's life hung in the balance, I realized something. I wasn't the same person who had walked into this world all those years ago. I had changed. I had become someone who would no longer be defined by my past, by duty or obligation. I was carving my own path, one step at a time. But as I prepared to take the final step, I couldn't shake the feeling that the game wasn't over yet. Hamlet had been reborn just like me. The question was, would he ever let go of the past? Or would he continue to live in the shadows of his own regrets, unable to break free from the chains of love that had once bound him? I was about to find out. The decision had been made. Hamlet's fate was in my hands now, just as much as my own. The power I had once feared was now mine to wield, and though the responsibility was heavy, I didn't flinch. This wasn't the naive Livy who had once hoped to be a dutiful wife, locked in a marriage that wasn't hers to control. This Livy was someone new, someone who had found strength in the ashes of her past. But even as I prepared to execute my plan, a deep unease began to settle in my chest. It wasn't about Hamlet anymore. It wasn't about saving his family. It was about something more complex, something I couldn't entirely understand yet. I had been given a second chance at life. And in this life, I would not be a passive player. The battle for power the day Hamlet's mother and I sealed our agreement was the first day of the rest of my life. The shares, the control, the power, everything was now mine for the taking. But I couldn't ignore the cold, hard truth. Nothing was as simple as it seemed. Even with all the wealth, all the influence I had acquired, there was still something missing. And it wasn't just Hamlet. For the first time in years, I felt free to pursue what I wanted. I wasn't bound by family, duty, or the contract. I was free to carve out my own path. But there was a cost. The weight of that decision was settling heavily on my shoulders. Every step I took forward, I felt it. What was I really doing? What was the price of all this freedom? Was it worth it? Hamlet's fragile mind. I hadn't seen Hamlet in days. After our last interaction, I had kept my distance, knowing that I needed to focus on my plans, on my future. But there was still that nagging feeling, that tiny sliver of guilt. Hamlet had always been someone I cared about, despite everything. Even after all the hurt he had caused, even after all the mistakes he had made, I couldn't just forget him. He had been the center of my world for so long, and now I was walking away from him. When I finally visited him in the hospital, the sight of him, sitting there, so broken and lost, hit me harder than I expected. His mind, still hazy from the accident, seemed to be fighting to make sense of the world around him. The confusion in his eyes was palpable. "Livy," he whispered as I entered, his voice hoarse. "Is it true? Are you really going to leave me?" I sat down next to him, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to do this, I reminded myself. I couldn't keep playing the role of the dutiful wife. But hearing his voice, seeing the confusion in his eyes, it felt like a knife twisting in my gut. "You're not the person I thought you were, Hamlet," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "You don't even know who I am anymore, do you? You've never loved me. You've only ever loved her, Regina." The words were harsh, but they were the truth. Hamlet stared at me, his eyes wide, his expression one of complete disbelief. "I love you, Livy," he said, his voice breaking. "I've always loved you. I shook my head, unable to hold back the tears. No, you don't. You love the idea of me, the woman who would save you. But that wasn't love. It was duty. You were never truly mine, Hamlet. Not in the way that matters. His gaze fell to the floor, his shoulders shaking with emotion. And in that moment, I realized something. I had been living in the past, too. I had been holding on to a version of Hamlet that didn't exist anymore, a version that never was. Regina's return. I had spent so much time focused on Hamlet's pain, on the broken man he had become, that I had almost forgotten about Regina. But she hadn't forgotten about him. She never would. It was inevitable, really. Regina, with her beauty and charm, had always been the center of Hamlet's world. And now that he was awake, now that he was no longer a shell of a person, she would be back in his life, no matter how much I tried to keep her out. I first heard about it through the grapevine. A private meeting. A whispered conversation. Regina had returned to the Hamlet family, and she was determined to make things right in the way that only she could. She was playing the victim card now, crying about how Hamlet had been the love of her life, how she never meant to hurt him. The media was eating it up. The public, too, was falling for her act. I had to admit, I was impressed. She was good, very good. But I wasn't about to let her waltz back into Hamlet's life without a fight. The last confrontation the day Regina showed up at the hospital, I knew that things were about to get complicated. Hamlet had been slowly regaining his strength, but seeing her there, standing by his bedside, watching him like he was her possession, triggered something deep inside me. A fire, something I had thought I'd buried long ago, flared up in my chest. I wasn't going to let her take him again. Not without a fight. Regina, I said, my voice calm, but with an edge that I couldn't hide. She turned to face me, a look of surprise flashing across her face. You're back, I said, stepping closer to them. And what? You think you can just pick up where you left off? That Hamlet will forget everything that's happened? She smiled, a perfect, calculated smile that sent a chill down my spine. I never meant for things to go this way, Livy. But Hamlet and I were meant to be together. We always were. I couldn't contain the laughter that bubbled up, bitter and sharp. Meant to be? You've ruined his life, Regina. And now you want to waltz back in and play the role of the doting lover? Regina's eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned her attention back to Hamlet, who was sitting in his hospital bed, looking between the two of us like a confused child. Hamlet, she said softly, I've been so worried about you. I never stopped thinking about you. I could see the way his eyes softened. The way he reached out for her hand. I felt sick to my stomach, but I couldn't look away. This was the man who had once been my everything, now lost in the fog of his own regrets. Breaking point as I watched Hamlet's attention shift entirely to Regina, something inside me broke. I had spent so many years fighting for him, sacrificing so much, and this was how it ended? In the arms of the woman who had always been his true love? I couldn't keep pretending anymore. This was it. I had done everything I could. And now, I was walking away. With one last look at Hamlet, at the man who would never truly be mine, I turned and walked out of the room, my heart heavy but resolute. I had no more tears to shed for him. A new beginning. As I stepped out of the hospital, I felt the weight of the world fall away. For the first time, I felt free. Completely free. I wasn't sure where the road ahead would lead me, but I knew one thing, it was my road now. And I wasn't going to let anyone, Hamlet, Regina, or even Hamlet's mother, control it. I had made my choices. And now, I was ready to face the consequences, whatever they might be. The cold air hit my face as I stepped out of the hospital doors. I took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill my lungs. It was over. For the first time in years, I wasn't weighed down by duty, regret, or longing. I had finally freed myself from Hamlet, from Regina, from the endless cycle of betrayal and disappointment. And yet, as I walked away, a small part of me couldn't help but wonder, had I truly won? The fall of the Hamlet family. Regina thought she had won. She believed that now that Hamlet was awake, now that I had walked away, she could reclaim the life she had always wanted. But reality had other plans. The public, once blinded by her beauty and charm, had turned against her. The scandal of her deception still lingered, and no amount of carefully crafted sob stories could erase the truth. The final blow came when the last of the Hamlet family's investments crumbled. The company that had once been their pride was now on the brink of collapse. Stocks plummeted. Investors pulled out. Employees walked away. And through it all, Hamlet's mother, once a woman of steel, had become a shadow of her former self. The weight of losing everything had finally crushed her. The mighty Hamlet family was no more. And yet, even as they fell, I felt no satisfaction. Because winning this battle had never really been about them. It had been about me. About reclaiming my life. A last conversation with Hamlet. A few days later, Hamlet found me. I had expected this. I knew that he would seek me out once the reality of his situation set in. I sat at a quiet cafe, sipping my coffee, when I felt his presence before I even turned around. I glanced up, meeting his tired eyes. He looked older. Not just in appearance, but in spirit. As if he had finally seen the truth of the world. "Livy," he said, his voice hesitant. I set my cup down, leaning back in my chair. "Hamlet." For a moment, he said nothing. He just stared at me, as if trying to find the right words. But there were no right words. Not anymore. I was wrong, he admitted finally, his voice thick with regret. About everything. About you. About us. I tilted my head slightly, studying him. What exactly were you wrong about, Hamlet? His jaw tightened. About not seeing you. About not realizing what I had until it was too late. I sighed. And now that it's too late, you expect me to do what? Forget everything? Go back to how things used to be? His expression twisted. I don't expect anything. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in his eyes. I just wanted you to know. I wanted to say, I'm sorry. I stared at him, at the man I had once given my heart to. And in that moment, I realized something. I no longer felt anything for him. No anger. No pain. No longing. Nothing. And that was the biggest victory of all. I accept your apology, I said calmly. But it doesn't change anything. His shoulders sagged slightly, as if he had been holding on to the faintest hope that things could be different. He nodded slowly. You're really not coming back, are you? I smiled, but it was bittersweet. No, Hamlet. I'm not. And with that, I stood up, leaving him behind for the final time. A future of my own making for the first time, I had no strings tying me down. No family obligations. No contracts. No broken love stories. Just me, and the road ahead. And I had big plans. With the wealth and influence I had gained from my investments, I was ready to build something new, something that belonged only to me. A company, a legacy, a life where I called the shots. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't trying to fix someone else's broken pieces. I was finally, truly, living. Galahad's unexpected proposal. As I stepped out of my car later that evening, a familiar voice called out to me. Boss lady. I turned and found Galahad leaning casually against my front gate, his signature grin in place. You have a habit of appearing at the strangest times, I mused, crossing my arms. He smirked. What can I say? I have great timing. I rolled my eyes. What do you want, Galahad? He stepped closer, his playful demeanor softening just slightly. I heard about Hamlet. About everything. And I figured, he hesitated for a fraction of a second before continuing, maybe you're finally ready to stop running. I arched an eyebrow. Running from what? From someone who actually cares about you, he said smoothly, a hint of something deeper in his voice. For a moment, I was speechless. Galahad had always been there, hovering in the background, teasing, challenging me. But this was different. This was real. And for the first time, I let myself consider the possibility. I took a deep breath and smirked. Are you saying you're that someone, Galahad? He grinned. Well, if you don't have any other candidates, I chuckled, shaking my head. You're impossible. And yet, you haven't told me to leave. I sighed, pretending to be exasperated. Fine. Dinner. One dinner. That's it. His grin widened. That's all I need. As I led him inside, I realized something. I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of love. Not of the future. Not of anything. I had fought my battles, and I had won. And now, I was ready to write a new story. One that was completely my own.